Fort Westlake sat just outside the shadow of the Nevada test range, once humming with the growl of warthogs circling overhead. These days, the place barely registered a pulse. Since the 2011 restructuring moved the 74th Fighter Squadron out, the base had withered into a logistics depot supply crates, paperwork, and weekend drills. Old hangars that once housed live-armed A-10s now stored pallets of cable spools and spare filters. The faded concrete runways were cracked and lined with scrub. Every few weeks, a C-130 might touch down for cargo drop-off, but most days, the flight line stayed empty, bleached pale by the desert sun. By 6:15 each morning, the same beat-up Ford pickup would roll through the gate. The guards barely glanced up anymore. Helen Cross, badge clipped to her collar, walked past the wire fence and into the electrical station before the base stirred. No one paid attention. She never lingered, never smiled long enough for anyone to wonder who she was. Helen was 43, hair tied back in a frayed bun, hands always stained with hydraulic fluid or conduit dust. She didn't wear standard-issue fatigues. Her uniform was gray coveralls with small loops for tools she rarely used in front of others. Everyone called her the wire tech or breaker lady. Sometimes it was voltage ghost, always behind her back. At 7:30, she'd be walking the south trench, checking relay panels tied to the base's internal grid. Once a week, she repaired the backup for the radar uplink, even though the radar itself hadn't picked up anything in years. She rarely needed help. When she did, she asked in one-sentence bursts, then disappeared again. The junior airmen didn't bother learning her name. Maintenance requests tagged to her were ignored until she showed up with a multimeter and solder gun in hand. Then someone would crack a joke about how whatever she touched must have burned out on purpose. She never replied. Inside the administration building, people passed her like she wasn't there. She fixed the server cooling fan one day in silence, replaced the outdated surge protectors with military-grade replacements she ordered without paperwork. The IT staff never asked who had done the upgrade. On Fridays, Helen cleaned the flag by the main gate with slow, measured hands. No one assigned her the task. She just did it. She knew where the fibers frayed from the wind, where dust collected behind the mount bolts. Her fingertips found wear before the eye could see it. A few officers had served long enough to remember her name from somewhere, but no one connected the dots. She was just background noise, a fixture. She had no friends, no call sign, no records that mattered. Her personnel file listed civilian contractor since 2012, prior history redacted under civilian clearance level 4. Only one man ever watched her twice. Retired Lieutenant Colonel John Miles, now head of base archives, sometimes paused when Helen passed by. His fingers twitched slightly, like memory brushing against something familiar but not quite tangible. He never asked her anything, just watched. The base, in its current form, was a quiet hum of mediocrity. No drills, no briefings with urgency, no overhead threat. Fort Westlake existed to maintain readiness on paper. No one expected to launch fighters. No one expected to fight. But at 6:15, 6 days a week, Helen showed up. By 1845, she was the last to leave. When the base lights flickered at 21 o'clock, it was always because she'd rerouted load-bearing transformers on her own. And when the storm knocked out power 2 winters ago, she was the only one who knew how to bring it back without waiting for Reno. She didn't do it for thanks, and no one offered them anyway. Helen worked below ground more often than above. At 8:20, she descended into the West Trench to inspect a corroded relay panel connected to the main grid. She moved with familiarity, kneeling beside the weather-sealed case, her gloves brushing away grit before she even unscrewed the panel. The label print was decades old, faded past readability, but she didn't need it. Her hand went straight to line 3. The fuse wasn't blown, just loose. She adjusted it with a firm grip and clicked the housing back into place before anyone noticed there'd been a dip in power. Across the airstrip, she spent 2 hours at the antenna bank checking ground cable insulation. Each coaxial line was connected to a secondary UHF receiver that nobody had used in at least 8 years. Still, she logged the impedance numbers in her spiral notebook. Nobody asked to see it. They never did. At 10:45, 2 junior airmen passed her near the fuel depot. One of them nodded, the other muttered, "She's like a ghost, that one. Doesn't she get tired of wires?" The first laughed, then added, "If the lights flicker, just wait for the voltage witch to show up." They kept walking. She didn't respond. She moved on to the flight line. Generator 4 needed a full output check. She powered it up manually, bypassing the start controller with a short test loop she'd built herself out of spare leads. The engine cranked up with a slow rumble. The voltage was steady. No one came to see why it worked. At 13 o'clock, she crossed the administrative yard with her tool pouch, heading toward the older HVAC units behind the motor pool. The fan delay relays had been tripping lately. She already knew which units had been retrofitted with off-brand thermostats. She'd seen the soldering wrong type, wrong joint. Someone from logistics said she had the look of a retired school bus mechanic. Another said she must have failed Air Force tech school twice to end up doing scut work on an abandoned base. These comments weren't cruel, just lazy. Nobody thought enough about her to be cruel. She didn't eat with anyone. Lunch was always at 12:30, same bench near the comms shed. She ate tuna with crackers and read through system diagrams that no one else had updated since 2010. Most of the base wiring hadn't been mapped since the original squadron left. She knew where every line ran, just by feel. That afternoon, a radar tech flagged a faulty feed into the VHF tower, and someone suggested calling for outside contractors. Helen walked into the room, crouched beneath the console, and came out 5 minutes later with a cracked solder bead in her palm. The system blinked green. Nobody thanked her. Retired Lieutenant Colonel John Miles watched from the hallway. His desk sat in records, but he'd wandered toward engineering after the fire drill. When she left, he stared at the empty doorway for a few seconds longer than made sense. He tapped a finger against his temple once, slowly. He remembered something strange. Back in 2012, someone had asked to have the old radar blueprints pulled for cross-checking electrical feeds. He couldn't remember who signed the request, but he remembered the request itself. It wasn't routine, it was surgical. Later, he passed Helen in the hallway and noticed her eyes track the conduit layout above them. She glanced once, then looked away. It was barely a twitch, but it registered, like someone memorizing a checklist without being asked. By 17:30, she was at the south motor pool, replacing a circuit breaker no one had logged as faulty. It had overheated from a stuck idle fan. She spotted it from across the lot. She didn't explain how. Someone once joked she was solar-powered, that she vanished at night. But John Miles started writing her name down in a small notebook, not for suspicion, but out of curiosity. He had the sense there was more to her than wattage and wire. Helen wasn't invisible. She just moved like someone who had learned silence worked better than explanation. She didn't correct anyone, didn't push back. She showed up, she repaired, she left. It was 15:10 when Helen stopped just inside the threshold of Hangar 3. The space hadn't seen a working aircraft in years, but the A-10 inside still sat like it was waiting for orders. Dust settled on the canopy in soft layers, and bird droppings lined the rudder base. It didn't matter. She stood there, hands loose at her sides, looking at it the way someone might look at a childhood home. The Warthog's paint was faded, its dull gray skin scuffed from weather and neglect. The tail number had long since been retired. Its tires were cracked, and one wingtip drooped slightly from a sagging hydraulic strut. Helen didn't blink. Her eyes moved over every inch of the airframe like she could see through the dust and age. She didn't touch it, didn't need to. She just stared. An airman crossed behind her and did a double take. He was maybe 23, in clean fatigues, and carried the kind of authority that came from inexperience. He snapped, "Civilian access is restricted here. Ma'am, this is a no-entry zone." Helen turned her head slightly. She gave him a short nod and stepped back without a word. He never asked for her name. Her boots scuffed quietly against the hangar floor as she left, the sound echoing off the walls for a second longer than it should have. Across the base, Miles sat at a long wooden table in the records office, flipping through requisition logs from 2009. The power had blinked earlier, and he was verifying backup routing when he heard the story. Someone had seen the breaker lady inside the old flight hangar, standing too still for too long. He didn't think much of it at first. Then later that night, at 1940, Miles was sorting out old service patches for archival and froze when he came across a photo in the bottom of a transfer box. It was a squadron group shot taken in Kandahar in 2009. 10 pilots stood next to 3 Warthogs. He looked at the pilot third from the left. The name stitched into the flight suit said Cross. The face wasn't crystal clear, but it was close enough. The next morning, he spotted Helen by the perimeter tower, examining a cracked fuse box. A gust of wind tugged at her jacket sleeve. It shifted just enough to expose a faded, embroidered patch beneath her outer layer. He saw the tail edge of a red hawk stitched against a black background. That patch didn't belong to her current uniform. It didn't belong on base at all anymore. He didn't approach her. He went back to his office, pulled out the personnel archives from 11 years ago, and searched for the call sign Red Hawk. 2 entries were classified. One was marked MIA, Captain Helen Cross, last logged sortie 2011. Sangin District, Afghanistan, aircraft lost, no recovery. Miles leaned back slowly in his chair, the weight of realization settling like a dropped gear. No one else on base remembered that name. Most of the staff had rotated out years ago. Younger officers knew only the post-drawdown version of Fort Westlake. They had no reason to look back that far. But Miles remembered Sangin. He remembered the months when warthogs flew daily, scrambling on call to cover convoy missions, medevac cover, and close air support. He remembered losing 2 pilots to insurgent fire, and he remembered the silence that followed when Cross's bird went down and the search came up empty. Helen kept her head low that week. She checked transformers, resealed a junction box behind the mess hall, and patched the fiber line beneath the motor pool. She was just as thorough as always. Nothing about her routine changed. But Miles did. He walked slower, watched longer. His eyes tracked her from the side hallways and admin corridors, not with suspicion, but with the kind of focused hesitation that comes before someone says something they're not sure they're ready to say. He opened her personnel file one last time. It hadn't changed. Still listed her as contractor, civilian status, activated for base power maintenance. There was a note about prior service, but it had been redacted. He didn't need the rest. He saw what he saw. The way her hands moved when she twisted a fuse block into place. The way she scanned flight line systems like she could hear the voltage hum. The way she'd looked at the A-10 in Hangar 3. Miles closed the file and placed it back in the drawer. Then he locked the drawer, sat down, and waited. Because something told him the past had never actually left Fort Westlake. It had just gone underground, waiting to be called back. At 14:07, the air inside Fort Westlake shifted. A long, rising tone echoed through the base intercom, followed by the clipped voice of the operations duty officer announcing a Redcon 1 alert. The words hit like a punch. Most of the personnel had never even heard the alarm test, let alone the real thing. Inside the command post, the A-10 FPS 117 radar lit up with 4 crimson tracks moving eastward at supersonic speed. They had broken the 25-mile perimeter, already inside restricted airspace. There was no radio contact, no transponder. The flight profile was tight, aggressive, and coordinated. Lieutenant Roberts stared at the screen, his hands frozen above the keyboard. He'd only trained for weather diversion and airlift tracking. Beside him, a captain flipped through laminated protocol cards, most of which applied to cargo reroutes or medevac coordination. This wasn't a drill. By 14:10, the watch commander reached for the secure line to Nellis AFB, but there was static on the channel. The fallback frequency was dead. The radar crew confirmed jamming interference, likely coming from the inbound aircraft themselves. Someone in the room asked, "Can we scramble anyone?" A long silence followed. The base had no operational squadrons. The last active A-10 was mothballed in Hangar 3, and even if it were flight-ready, there were no rated pilots assigned to the base. Everyone present was logistics, IT, civil engineering, or admin. Lieutenant Walsh, the youngest officer in the room, pushed his chair back and turned to the assembled staff. "Does anyone here know how to fly? Not Cessnas, not simulators, an A-10. His voice cracked halfway through. A senior master sergeant cleared his throat. "I did 2 tours on crew chief detail back in Osan. I could pre-flight 1, but fly? No way." Another technician chimed in that he flew rotary drones for ISR missions. That didn't help. The tone in the room shifted from alarm to dread. Pages flipped wildly as names were checked against old personnel rosters, retirees, civilian contractors, anyone with logged stick time in fixed-wing combat aircraft. The system showed no active or even reserve combat pilots currently assigned to Westlake. By 14:14, the incoming tracks had reached 12 nautical miles. The base's old Hawk missile battery was decommissioned years ago. The only defensive assets were perimeter watch and small arms, the kind of defense that worked against intrusion, not aerial assault. 1 airman, barely 20, said under his breath, "Are we just supposed to sit here and wait for it?" Nobody answered him. In the middle of the chaos, someone tripped over a cable in the emergency comms locker. A storage box fell open. Inside, beneath outdated flare rounds and decommissioned IFF gear, was a small ID folder, covered in dust and curled from age. They picked it up out of reflex. It was a military card. Rank, Captain. Name, Helen R. Cross. Status, USAF, 74th Fighter Squadron, Michigan, a 2011. The room stilled. The ID card was bent at the corners, its lamination faded from age and storage heat. It had slipped loose from an old equipment box when one of the radar techs yanked out a backup handset. At first, no one looked closely. Then, someone read the name aloud. Captain Helen R. Cross. United States Air Force. 74th Fighter Squadron. Status, MIA, March 2011. Lieutenant Walsh took the card slowly. He looked around the room, unsure whether it was some forgotten keepsake or a ghost record misfiled during the base's restructuring. Then he said it louder, his voice shaking. Is this real?" Across the hall, Miles appeared at the door. He saw the card and didn't hesitate. His voice came low, almost reverent. "That's her. That's Helen Cross. That's Red Hawk 6. He paused, like trying to steady his breath. "She flew CAS in Sangin. We lost her 12 years ago." The room fell silent. Officers stood motionless. Screens blinked. The alert tone continued its steady wail in the background, but no one moved. At 14:17, Helen walked into the operations center like she belonged there. Her coveralls were still dusty from the tower junction box she'd just finished sealing. The zipper at her collar was halfway open, revealing the edge of the same faded Red Hawk patch Miles had seen days earlier. She didn't ask what they'd found. She didn't ask how they'd found it. She just looked directly at Walsh, then at Miles, and spoke with clipped calm. "I need 5 minutes. The bird in Hangar 3, can it still roll?" Someone stammered that it hadn't been tested in years. Another said the avionics were probably cold. Helen didn't flinch. She replied, "Get me a ladder and a start cart. I'll handle the rest." Miles stepped forward, eyes fixed on her like he was seeing a ghost take shape. No salute, no words, just understanding. Helen turned toward the door. For a moment, no one followed. Then Walsh barked into the radio for the hangar crew to clear a path to runway 2. The voice on the other end didn't ask why. By 14:19, everyone in the command center had stopped what they were doing. Maps, screens, and protocols lay forgotten. Every eye tracked Helen as she walked out, back straight, movements deliberate. Not a single person asked how a civilian contractor knew exactly what to do during a base-level air incursion. Not one person asked why the name of a missing pilot from 2011 was walking calmly toward a hangar like the years had never passed. The doors to Hangar 3 groaned open at 14:23, light spilling in across the concrete like a stage. Helen walked in without slowing. She moved like she'd never left. The A-10 sat in shadow, engines quiet, paint dulled from time. The maintenance tag still hung from the nose gear. No one had touched the plane in over a decade, but she approached it with the familiarity of someone returning to a trusted friend, not an artifact. She placed her hand on the GAU-8 housing and stood still. No words. Just connection. Then she stepped into motion. Her inspection was silent and exact. She started at the left wing, running fingers across the leading edge, checking for corrosion on the control surfaces. The ailerons held firm. She crouched, checked the trim tabs and hinges, confirmed the tactile response of the flap actuation linkages. On the right wing, she opened the access panel for the hydraulic actuator and peered inside. Her flashlight flickered once against the line hoses, her eyes narrowing. She nodded slightly, then resecured the panel without a word. At 14:28, she climbed the ladder. The cockpit canopy creaked as she slid it open, revealing dust across the old CRTs and switches. She reached for the emergency battery toggle and held it for 3 seconds. The master caution light blinked alive. Systems were dormant but intact. Her left hand moved over the primary flight controls. She ran a check of the throttle friction knob, then toggled the CDU interface. It didn't respond immediately, so she bypassed it, flipping the backup avionics bus manually. The screens came alive, slower than usual but functional. Outside, a crew chief stood with a headset in hand, staring. He hadn't moved since she walked in. Two other airmen stood a few feet behind him. None of them spoke. No one had been briefed. No one had given permission, but none of them stopped her either. At 14:32, Helen opened the right panel on the nose gear bay and pulled the external power line out herself. She waved the crew chief over. He jogged forward like muscle memory had taken over. His hands trembled slightly as he plugged in the cart. She nodded once. By 14:35, she was in the cockpit, helmet on, oxygen hose connected. Her fingers moved through the startup sequence from memory. APU switched to on. EGI align initiated. Engine 1 clear. Spool. Throttle idle. Ignition confirmed. Engine 2. Same sequence. The whine of the engines began to fill the hangar, rising in pitch and pressure. The A-10 was waking up. Helen adjusted the HUD brightness, checked the RWR and countermeasure programs, then entered a cold code into the CMS panel. The system flashed ready. She tapped in the code again. This time it took. At 14:39, the aircraft powered to full system sync. The hydraulic pressure stabilized. Flaps ran a full cycle. She adjusted the seat height, then locked it. The stick settled into her palm like it had never left. The crew chief stood there with wide eyes. He spoke into his headset. She heard the tremor in his voice when he said, "Aircraft pre-flight confirmed. Pilot. Pilot in control." Helen didn't reply. She raised one hand and gave a small nod. Then she keyed the internal comms line and said, quietly, "I'm rolling to 2. No tower was active. No clearance had been given. But the entire taxi route cleared ahead of her. By 14:42, the A-10 rolled past the threshold of runway 2. Weeds cracked beneath her wheels. No comms traffic. No tower clearance. Just air and instinct. Helen pushed the throttles forward. Engines responded with a steady roar. Nose up at 135 knots. Gear up by 400 feet. She climbed to 600 AGL, then dropped low, banking hard southeast and leveling off at just under 200 feet. She flew nap of the earth, riding the terrain like a memory. The Warthog wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It survived low, where missiles lost lock and radar lost line of sight. The canyon ridge northeast of the base gave her cover. She threaded it tight, never rising above the crest. By 14:48, she was within 5 miles of the intruders. Her RWR pinged intermittent threat signals, not locks, just sweeps. She stayed masked. Her eyes flicked between the HUD and the terrain, one hand on the stick, the other hovering over the weapon select panel. She armed Station 3 and 9, AGM-65D Mavericks, infrared seekers, short lock range but no guidance lag. The targeting pod activated. She climbed slightly, just enough to acquire a silhouette sleek, delta-winged, not U.S. origin. Her heart didn't race, no adrenaline, just breath and angles. She locked the first one on the left edge of the formation, maneuvering erratic, like they weren't expecting resistance. She fired. 1 second of silence, then a dull whoosh as the missile dropped and ignited. She rolled left, dove into the terrain, eyes on the altimeter. The Maverick struck just under the enemy's starboard intake. The aircraft broke midair, folding into fire and metal before it hit the ridge below. Helen didn't celebrate. She pulled up hard, staying in the valley's shadow. Her second lock came faster. The lead aircraft banked right, rising. She climbed with it, using its own silhouette as a backdrop for target masking. The pod locked. She squeezed the release. Second Maverick away. She dropped hard, pulling G's as the terrain closed in. The second target exploded just above the ridge. Shrapnel rained down behind her as she threaded the narrow exit pass. By 14:52, 2 of the 4 threats were gone. Helen didn't radio in, didn't ask for confirmation. She just adjusted trim, checked the systems for temperature rise, and prepped the countermeasure suite for the next phase. The Warthog flew solid beneath her. No tremble, no shake. It obeyed, because it remembered her. And she remembered everything. By 14:54, only 2 enemy aircraft remained. One was trailing smoke, falling back toward open airspace. The last stayed low, vectoring fast toward Fort Westlake. It wasn't regrouping. It was committing. Helen caught the angle from her left side scan, saw its dive pattern shift into direct descent. The nose pitched down steep, speed building. It wasn't maneuvering for a missile run. It was aiming straight at the base. No time for flanking. No time for altitude tactics. She pulled hard into a climb, throttles maxed, gear up, flaps clean. The A-10 groaned under the sudden G-force. Her eyes narrowed, locking on the speck moving across the HUD. She passed 8,000 feet in seconds, the engines screaming under strain. At 15 o'clock, she hit the apex, nosed up to nearly vertical, then inverted the bird in one tight roll. Downward now, sight picture aligned. She let instinct take over. No time for targeting systems. The enemy aircraft was closing on the base perimeter. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. A stream of depleted uranium rounds carved the air like a buzzsaw. She didn't adjust her path. She just flew right through the shot. The rounds ripped through the attacker's fuselage. A plume of black and orange fire burst just outside the fence line. The jet tumbled apart mid-air, a mangled streak of flame vanishing into the ground. But Helen was already in trouble. The maneuver had pulled too much from the Warthog. Her port engine temp spiked. Warnings flashed across the console. Hydraulics redlined. Trim was gone. She leveled the aircraft by muscle alone. No assist. No flight computer. The right gear wouldn't extend. Flap control was lost. She circled once, saw the cracked remains of runway 2 below, weeds, uneven concrete. No time to second guess. She throttled back, dropped speed to 110 knots, slid the nose just enough to bleed air. Then she let the A-10 settle. The belly hit hard, scraping metal and showering sparks along the length of the old strip. One of the main gear housings tore free. The aircraft yawed left, dragging across the line. She fought it all the way. When it finally stopped, the cockpit filled with haze. Smoke from the rear systems hissed upward, mixing with coolant and scorched rubber. She shut down the engines, pulled the canopy lever. At 15:06, Helen climbed out. Her boots hit the runway. Her flight suit was streaked with oil and fire marks. Her oxygen mask hung loose around her neck. She walked 2 steps forward, steady, then stood. The fire crews were already running, but they slowed when they saw her standing. She didn't raise her hand, didn't wave. She just waited as the wind caught the edge of her patch still intact, still red. Red Hawk. The haze from the belly landing hadn't fully cleared when Helen reached the edge of the tarmac. Her boots left faint smears on the runway, streaks of oil and brake dust trailing behind her. The fire crews had stopped 20 yards short, unsure if they were supposed to offer help or stand down. She walked past them without breaking stride. At 15:12, the first salute came from a young airman who had once laughed at her over a broken HVAC relay. His hand rose stiffly, not out of formality but reverence. He didn't say anything. He just held it there until she passed. Then another followed, and another. Within minutes, the entire outer perimeter was lined with salutes. Officers, civilians, logistics techs, even the chow hall manager stepped out and stood at attention. Helen didn't acknowledge the crowd, not because she didn't care, but because that wasn't why she flew. She walked straight toward the admin building with her helmet in hand and her head level. It wasn't pride. It was purpose. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel John Miles waited near the front desk with a box. Inside was a single item, the original 74th FS command pin, its silver edges dulled by time. He stepped forward as she entered, eyes wet but voice steady. "They're reactivating the squadron. You're the last combat-rated pilot still alive from the original roster. This belongs to you." Helen looked at the pin, then back at him. She held his gaze for a long second, then shook her head slowly. Her voice was quiet. "Let it go to someone new, someone who wants the ceremony. I've got work to finish in Sector 4. He didn't argue. She turned and walked toward the engineering annex. Her gait had a slight limp now, from the landing, but she didn't slow down. A few officers tried to catch up and offer medical checks. She waved them off without speaking. At 16:40, she walked into her usual work bay. The lights flickered once a relay issue she'd already flagged last week. She set her helmet down on the bench, opened the drawer where her old soldering kit sat, and checked the battery pack inside. Still full. The whiteboard next to her desk was clean. She picked up a marker and wrote, in the corner, "Loud doesn't mean ready. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Sometimes, calm is the most dangerous thing in the room." Then she capped the pen and placed it back exactly where it had been. By 17 o'clock, she was back in the south corridor, checking voltage logs from the day before. A junior tech passed her, nodded once, and didn't speak. But his eyes didn't carry ignorance anymore. They carried something else, something closer to awe. Helen didn't ask for thanks. She never had. But the silence around her had changed. It was no longer the quiet of being ignored. It was the quiet of being understood. 2 weeks passed before anyone said the word hero out loud. It didn't happen in a briefing or speech. It happened in the dining hall, over cold lasagna, when a second lieutenant quietly asked if anyone else had seen the old photo. The image had been reinstalled in the front hallway. It was the same black and white squadron shot from Kandahar. 10 pilots, full flight gear, standing between 2 warthogs. The brass plaque beneath it used to say, "In honor of the lost." Now it simply read, "Returned." Someone had buffed the frame. Someone else had added Helen's name again to the base personnel list. But she hadn't signed off on it, and no one had dared ask her to. The base didn't talk about her often, not publicly. But the way people moved had shifted. Maintenance requests were handled faster. Briefings started on time. People showed up early and left a little later. Not because anyone ordered them to, because they wanted to. At 7:10 one morning, a group of junior airmen gathered near the old simulator pod. It hadn't worked in years. One of them had watched Helen from a distance and started sketching out what she called field pattern flight techniques that weren't in any textbook. By noon, someone had drawn up an outline for a training program. Real-world situational flying. Tactical redundancy under comms failure. Emergency ingress using civilian grid overlays. They called it Cross Cadets. No one asked her permission. The proposal sat on Miles's desk by 15:30. He smiled when he read it, then initialed the bottom. The unit didn't need a name. It had already earned one. By Friday, a pilot trainer from Nellis made a visit. He didn't come with orders or demands. He came to ask a question. How did she do it? How did she fly cold systems with no FAC, no tower, no wingman? She never answered directly. She said, "I remembered the terrain." Then she asked if he wanted coffee. Around the base, things Helen had touched took on new meaning. Her old tools were cataloged. The wire map she drew by hand was copied and laminated. Her whiteboard message was framed. She didn't attend the reactivation ceremony for the 74th. She was on the roof that day, replacing a broken weather vane. From there, she could see the runway, the hangar, and the small formation of officers standing in a line. She nodded once, then went back to work. Legacy wasn't something she aimed for. It wasn't something she spoke about, but it settled around the base like a second skin. One that didn't need medals, just memory. At 6:15, the gate guard noticed something strange. The old Ford pickup didn't roll through. The coffee machine in Sector 4 stayed cold. By 6:40, her workbench was still untouched. At 7:05, someone checked the electrical log. No entry, no voltage readouts, no signature. On the duty officer's desk sat a folded note. No envelope, no stamp, just a single sheet of lined paper, left exactly where she'd placed it. The handwriting was neat. Not rushed, no sign-off, no name. It read, "The quiet ones fly higher than you think." No one tried to chase her down. There was no point. She hadn't disappeared. She'd just finished. Later that evening, someone walked the edge of runway 2. The sun was low. The wind tugged at the old windsock. And in that long stillness, it felt like she was still there. Not in shadow, not in silence, just above. Let me know if you'd like a compiled version of all parts or need voiceover-ready formatting.